To keep doing daily videos on YouTube, I need to raise my Patreon and Subscribestar income to a grand total of $200 a month. So if you're so inclined, help a chap out. Zang. Hello lovelies. A while back I did a video on the so-called Kalergi plan. Now there is no actual plan, at least not in the book that a lot of right-wing conspiracy theorists tend to point at, which is practical idealism. However, there were some criticisms that I felt had some validity, even if they were being overstated. So I've decided to revisit this. I've also decided to revisit this because the original video keeps getting monetized and demonetized and monetized and demonetized, probably because it's dealing with conspiracy theory content and YouTube bot isn't particularly clever, but it may have gotten a bit better in recent years. So I'm adding this filler to the beginning of the video, which helps with monetization, and I shall unusually attempt to avoid swearing throughout this video. But let's revisit the Kalergi plan, and let's also consider some of the criticisms that I've been given towards the end and anticipate the criticisms that I'm going to get on this video as well. Count Coudenhove Kalergi was a biracial Austrian-Japanese man, primarily known for his book Practical Idealism, which conspiracy theorists on the racist, right-wing, sort of end of the spectrum, they take this book to be some sort of blueprint for the destruction of the West, whatever that might happen to mean to them. Now, I made a previous video about this, which continues to get thousands of hits, peculiarly, but was demonetized, remonetized, demonetized, remonetized, despite being basically a debunking of this conspiracy theory, though I don't think I did quite as good of a job debunking it as I could have, because there are a bunch of distinct problems with the conspiracy theory that also make debunking the conspiracy theory quite difficult. So I've decided to revisit the issue here because I find these kind of lowbrow subterranean IQ comments and ad hominems from racist conspiracy theories to be quite amusing. So it all comes down to this guy, Count Coudenhove Kalergi, who is for some reason seen as some kind of force for evil on that side of the political, radical conspiracy theorist spectrum. You know, there are equally bad people on the other side of the aisle, but this is who we're talking about here. And he was half Austrian, half Japanese, as I said. I mean, just being biracial seems to be enough to enrage certain people. And not only that, he married a Jew, which also seems to have upset people a great deal. This despite his father, incidentally, being virulently anti-Semitic for much of his life, if not all of it. He was an early advocate of what was then called Pan-Europeanism, the idea that, this was after World War I and before World War II, that Europe should come together and federalise and do everything that it could to avoid the kind of conflagrations and conflicts such as the First World War and later on the Second World War. So the Pan-European movement was essentially proved rather correct there. And weirdly, it's this pro-Europeanism that seems to be the final nail in the coffin in terms of him being hated by the far right. Of course, he was a man of his time, and this book, Practical Idealism, was written in the mid-1920s, so to modernise a lot of it actually seems rather racist. So you would think that many of these people, who also often talk about Western culture or European culture as if it were unified already, and that being some kind of positive thing, you'd think they would be pro a pan-European approach, particularly as set out by Count Kalergi. But no. Yeah, it is inconsistent that these people who bang on about the glory of the West consistently and constantly, simultaneously, because of their nationalism, seek to undermine a step in the kind of unification and emergence of a European or Western identity that you would think they would be all for. Contextually, it's hardly surprising that a mixed-race gentleman in the post-World War I era and then later on in the post-World War II era would be keen on putting an end to racism and, having married a Jew, anti-Semitism, and would seek ever more strenuously, particularly after World War II, to put an end to these ruinous conflicts, to bring Europeans together, to advocate for a way in which we could entangle ourselves economically and politically and socially into a single block, but a distributed block. I don't see how that's sinister, seeking peace and prosperity, but somehow it is all seen as some kind of super sinister thing. So he wrote this book, Practical Idealism, which sets out his philosophy, makes some predictions, doesn't really contain a plan of any kind, though he did also separately write a manifesto called Paneuropa, which was his blueprint for how you might move towards a unified Europe. But that doesn't set out any of the things that these far-right conspiracy theorists really object to. But let's get into it. So the kinds of people who talk in hushed whispers about the Kalergi plan are generally referring to the content of practical idealism. But it's not a plan, nor a template, nor a guide for a conspiracy. It's just this one man's concepts and conceits and the lens of his life experience on how the problem of intra-European conflict might be dealt with, might be put into the past, and his predictions for the future. None of what he really lays out in Practical Idealism has come to pass, perhaps unfortunately, though some of his predictions have been somewhat true, but that won't stop people angrily ranting about it, or telling me I look like a freak, as though that was some kind of argument against what I'm saying when I debunk what they're saying about practical idealism. A big part of the barrier to understanding here, and to debunking as it happens, which is why I think my previous video wasn't as good as it could have been, is that Kalergi wrote in a somewhat archaic version of Austrian German. And there aren't really any decent translations available. And that's deeply unfortunate. The translations that are available online are gobbledygook. People have just rammed the raw text of Practical Idealism through Google Translate circa 2012 and hoped for the best. The more disingenuous of them have re-edited with their own personal biases from that Google translation, which is not great. Not great at all. You can get copies of it on Amazon, but these are similarly in Googleese from that 2012 Google translation, so far as I've been able to make out from the freely available snapshots from inside. And they've been compiled by people who are on this right-wing racist conspiracy theorist side of things. You know, their bias is plain and obvious to see, unfortunately. And if you look around online, you don't find anything any better. Almost everything seems to trace back to this 2012 Google translation, so it's all, I guess, what you'd call gobbledygoogle. I guess that's the Google Translate version of English. So it's gobbledygoogle. It's been edited by motivated racists, and this makes it unreliable and unreadable, but there aren't any motivated, non-partisan people around to translate it. So I'll have to take a Google translation, though I used the modern, up-to-date version of Google Translate. I'm hoping that in the last 7 years Google made some changes. I had to look up some individual words from obscure German, but then I laboriously went through and I did all that through the last couple of evenings and read it as best I could. Large tracts of it are essentially unreadable, but you would hope that various terms and words that people attribute to him would appear in a direct translation. And a lot of it is very easily misinterpreted, particularly when it doesn't scan in English. As I hinted at before, a lot of the irony that there is in the idea of the Kalergi plan and people's reference to practical idealism, the irony is that Kalergi, as a product of his time, the mid-1920s, when children's textbooks were across the world were happily informing people that eugenics was the way forward. Yeah, he was very much a product of his time, and he placed almost as much faith in racial theories as his white supremacist detractors do. It's just that he took a different line on it. He believed that multiracial and biracial people were superior, would produce a superior civilization, a more harmonious civilization. He had wonderful things to say about the Jews as a people and an ethnicity and as a race. One passage in particular seems to set the twat amongst the villains, where he talks about the race of the future being that mixed race, perhaps with an appearance akin to the ancient Egyptians. This, at least, was an accurate prediction of the future. More and more people are biracial and multiracial. The birth rate of multiracial children continues to climb, whatever race actually means when you drill down to it. But it was hardly a plan, it was a prediction, looking at the trends that were taking place at his time. And this wasn't even in a section of the book that was particularly talking about his ideas and thoughts and recommendations. It was just looking at what was going on and making some predictions and statements about the state of the world then and how it might be in the future. So even at his time of writing, 1925, for Practical Idealism, which this passage is in, rail travel was well established, air travel was taking off, the telegraph and the telephone, all of that was resulting in a much broader scale, particularly in his elevated social group, of intermarriage. So he could see even then the future being one of multiracial and multicultural people. This was a trend he could already see, particularly in the United States, which was already a melting pot country at that time, despite the deeply entrenched racism that didn't even start to disappear until the 1950s and 60s. Yeah, and we've seen that prediction come true over time. The number of multiracial children has risen from 5% of the total births in America in 1980 to 50% by 2015. That rate of change has probably accelerated. I couldn't find any more modern statistics on that. In Hawaii, interestingly enough, it's over 40% of births are multiracial, probably because Hawaii has a large native population, white population, black population and Japanese population. So but that would explain that. But that's a trend that I think we're going to see and continue to see elsewhere a great deal. Why would this be bad? It doesn't seem to be bad. Okay, there's a lot more multiracial children. Is this some insidious plot to wipe out the white race? It seems rather unlikely, since the blending also eliminates other races. So that can't be it. There are simpler explanations for this, for what's happening, rather than these meaningless racial divisions that people make. there is a strong psychological attraction to the other, to exoticize people from other races and cultures. This can be a negative, this can be a positive, but it certainly results in a lot of bumping of uglies, he said, studiously trying to avoid swearing. There is this strong attraction to the other, and it's as strong or more strong as the other side of attraction, which is for similarity, not to the level of intra-family reproduction, but we tend to be attracted to people who are either similar and on a similar attractiveness level to ourselves, or to the exotic other. Makes sound evolutionary sense. We would want to mix different genes, increase our gene pool diversity. I know that the word diversity will trigger some people, but genetic diversity is a good thing. It spreads resistance to certain diseases. It allows positive traits from one group to enter another and to blend. And humans have always blended. If you've ever done one of those genetic tests, you'll know that just about everybody has a bit of this, a bit of that, and a bit of the other in their ancestry, and a lot of that is because we're driven at a genetic level to diversify our gene pools. It makes us fitter and stronger. Extreme examples of that are so-called hybrid vigor, though the kind of cases that you'll find on Wikipedia and so on aren't necessarily positive. That's interspecies, and human races, we're all one species. So it's good for survival, and it's good for the genetic health of our populations to intermingle. And it's just that travel and communication has made this easier and more possible, and the steady decline in borders, or the increasing permeability in borders, though they tightened up in the early 20th century. And that's also allowed an increasing amount of intermarriage, and has also opened up the pool of potential mates that we have, because you can meet someone from far, far away and have a mutual attraction now, whereas before you were very much limited to a much closer geographic location. Now, this has undermined racism. It's undermined a lot of conflict, at least between the larger economic blocs, and on a personal level, it's harder to be negative and racist towards the other when you're part of the other. And settled ethnic subpopulations are part of the same social constructions that we have, our political constructions and affiliations, our religious affiliations, and so on. So this is a natural and positive progression, unless you place far too much stock in the idea of race or nation, of course. Conspiratorial racists will point at TV and advertising, and they will claim that this is pushing these multiracial families. Again, I point out that Kalergi wasn't pushing this, he was observing this and saying that it was a positive, or at least showing the upside to this, at a time when most people would have taken it as a negative. But conspiracists will point at TV and advertising and say that they're somehow executing part of the Kalergi plan by promoting multiracial and mixed ethnic families. The real reasons are far simpler, more prosaic than some kind of idealistic goal to blend the world into one sort of single, mildly brown sort of race, I guess. A multiracial family appeals to advertisers and to filmmakers and to TV makers and so on, because it can appeal to a far broader demographic by, or at least they think it does, by representing all of those different segments on screen. There's no conspiracy needed, just capitalism. If you've got a product and you want to appeal to a particular demographic, but you also want to appeal to another demographic and to another demographic, what better way than to have a black husband, a white wife, and some Asian adopted children on screen, tucking into their Rice Krispies or whatever else it might be. Capitalism can be sinister, but it's not some kind of racial or destroy the West or white genocide agenda. It's moolah. and that's really it. There's no conspiracy needed, just people motivated to make more money and to sell their product. Individual self-motivation. Another aspect of his writings that racists love to latch onto are the glowing terms in which he talks about the Jews. And remember, this was even before World War II, before the Holocaust. Maybe his wife was watching him as he wrote. I don't know. Regardless, there's no plan here. But again, there is a prediction and an observation, one that I don't think is as true as his multiracial thing, but I think he was perhaps biased by the presence of his wife. He observed that even before the Holocaust, before Israel came about, that the Jews were the first instance of what he saw as this new multicultural, multi-ethnic, distributed society as a result of their persecution and various pogroms against the Jews, that they had been scattered, that they had been forced to create transnational institutions, and that they were heavily motivated towards peace and prosperity as a people because of their experiences, and that people was made up of multiple ethnic groups all around the world who nonetheless all tied into this singular uniting culture of Judaism, even those who didn't believe in God and who were merely culturally Jewish. He saw the scattered Jewish people as this case in point with traditions and experiences that provided a useful well of knowledge that could be used to forge something new, potentially, that would bring everybody together. So he considered the Jews to be well positioned to lead that shift and change in society, not as architects of a conspiracy. He himself wasn't Jewish, but just as people whose knowledge and experience would be useful if the rest of us were to try and follow suit and forge this multinational, multi-ethnic identity in the future. So he was right about the persecution. The Holocaust only increased the relevance of that experience and its influence on the world, as everyone swore never again. Now, I can understand why that would upset racists, particularly anti-Semites, but it doesn't lend fuel to the fire of the idea that there's any kind of conspiracy here. Rather, it would explain the motivations and the relevancy of the Jewish experience to these internationalist efforts to bring people together. Other than that, and again, not plans, but predictions and thoughts, there is a kind of Fabian-style techno-socialist thread, a utopian socialist thread that runs through Kalergi, and the right, of course, doesn't like left-wing ideas. Kalergi himself doesn't seem to regard Marxism or the Soviet Union of the time in particularly glowing terms, and this was fairly early on in the life of the Soviet Union, sort of immediately post-revolution, where it was taken seriously as a Marxist experiment, where it was often seen by people outside as genuinely being some sort of utopia. Then Stalin kind of put a spanner in the works there, but even then Kalergi wasn't really speaking about them in glowing terms. His allegiance seems to have been to the earlier Fabian H.G. Wells style techno-socialism, if you will, and ideas that have come back into fashion, I think, as our technology has finally caught up to that idealism. So he's aligned more with moderate socialists rather than Marxists. The idea of technology liberating more and more people from debilitating work, increasing everyone's wealth, creating the conditions where we could afford a more socialist future. He wasn't wrong, but again, this isn't a plan, this is an observation and a prediction and his own ideological idealism coming through. There's nothing in this book, Practical Idealism, which could be called a plan, and nothing to indicate that this non-existent plan is in any way being enacted. The racist conspiracy theorists typically just claim that it's obvious somehow that Kalergi's plan is being enacted, even though they remain steadfastly unable to point it out. They will just sort of gesture at the world and say, look, it's obvious, without being able to point to anything in the plan or the existence of the plan, or how the plan is being implemented in any way. It's very disconcerting to have people insist that something that doesn't exist does exist, and furthermore is being implemented, but they remain completely unable to point to anything that remotely supports that contention. It makes it hard to debunk, because there is literally nothing to get your teeth into, as I think I'm demonstrating here. They can't point out where A, the Kalergi plan is, B, whether it's being enacted. They like to claim that mass immigration is part of it. I mean, mass is a subjective term, I would say, but immigration is only mentioned once in the book, Practical Idealism, and there he's talking about Australia. That's it. The term plan only appears once in the book. He does mention a potential program of suggested action, and perhaps that's where the confusion amongst the far-right conspiracy theorists is coming from, where they're mistaking Practical Idealism, the publication, for an entirely different publication called Paneuropa, which was published 2 years prior. There is a manifesto with a program of suggested action called Paneuropa, which was published in 1923, 2 years prior to Practical Idealism. Again, it's very hard to find a translation, but it is a whole other document, so I took the step of doing it myself. It's also one that mostly just sort of identifies and rehashes the problems that Europe faced in the early to mid 1920s, the rise of fascism, the rise of Bolshevism, the fact that we had gone to war in such a ruinous way, in our first truly mechanized industrial war, and the sheer ruin that brought. And it's basically a lot of hand-wringing about that, identifying the issues, identifying potential future issues, and there's not really a lot of plan in there after all. I think history recognizes that he was right about almost all the things that he identified as problems. But it's also weird, when you look at this program, a lot of it marries up to what white supremacists claim to believe. Kalergi believed that the sort of grand unifying principle of Western European man was Christianity. That Europe had a unique cultural identity, which a lot of people on the racist far right seem to believe as well, and he wanted to preserve that and to allow it to prosper. You would think white supremacists would be all for a pan-European identity, a pan-European culture, some kind of unifying thing for what they see as the white race, or what mildly less right-wing people talk about Western culture. Kalergi agreed with you on those points, and his program for a pan-European civilization and sort of organizational strata, the idea behind that was to stop people infighting and to create a counter-block to the emerging Russo-Chinese bloc at the time and America's economic and military power, to allow Europe to compete on a similar sort of level internationally, which these were the values that founded the European Union. So I guess you can say that it's being enacted in that sense, but there's very little else to it. And again, you should be for the European Union if you believe in this kind of European identity. And it talks of forging this European identity, and a lot of it, I read a lot of Victorian and early 20th century fiction, science fiction in particular, and there's a racist streak to a lot of it, and a lot of it talks about unifying Western man, or the sort of English and American fiction tends to talk about uniting the Anglo-Saxon race around the world against threats, typically China. Lots of yellow peril stuff going in there. And despite being half Japanese, there's echoes of a lot of that in Kalergi's writing there. So again, you would think that would kind of echo and vibe with the white supremacist right. Of course, he was progressive for his period. It's just from where we are now, he looks a bit dodgy. He looks more like the people who criticise him a great deal. It's only towards the end of this document, Paneuropa, which is an entirely separate document to Practical Idealism, that we get something like a plan. But it's not some sinister plot to destroy Europe, but rather one to save it, to forge this European identity that transcends borders, to prevent internal wars, to unify Europe financially and socially and even spiritually in his document, and to give it this unifying federal identity. It's an attempt to forge peace, to increase pacifism. He does talk about things like a customs union, things that we've seen the EU go about. It does set out a step-by-step path for the unification of Europe, but these are steps that would be obvious to anyone looking at and tackling the problem. And again, none of it mentions mass immigration or the destruction of the white race. Quite the opposite. But this was blue sky thinking at the time, not a plan. It was the mere seed of an idea. Sure, it's anti-nationalist. Yeah, there's that, I guess. But we're already in a kind of post-national world in a lot of ways due to the way in which the global economy works. Yeah, and there's a lot of other interests that kind of glom on around nationalism, corporatists, nationalists, militarists, and so on. So it was anti-nationalist but not anti-nation. There's nothing there that speaks of mass immigration or other bugbears of white nationalism. He doesn't talk about getting rid of the nation state, but federating it. Indeed, a lot of what he talks about is about preserving the individual character of European nations and localizing democracy as much as possible while having this federal structure in place on top. Indeed, these are founding principles of the EU, to preserve nations, to localize democracy as much as is humanly possible. It's kind of the opposite of the fiend that it's been painted as. And yet, weirdly, reading it, I see a lot of it that should commend it to this right-wing, nationalist, racist point of view, because they believe in this European identity, this Western identity that Kalergi was trying to sell, albeit on more liberal and internationalist grounds. But they have to pin this tide of rising liberalisation on a conspiracy. And they pin it on these documents that are hard to find, harder to read, and then if you do, it doesn't support their paranoia. So to recap, even in Paneuropa there isn't really a plan, there is a suggestion. The suggestions would be fairly obvious to anyone with an understanding of history, economics, politics, and so forth. Anybody who wrote any sort of plan for a gradualist unification of Europe would come up with the same ideas, by and large. So it's not surprising, it's not a plan, it's not a conspiracy, and the only thing remotely approaching a plan is not in Practical Idealism, but in his manifesto for a pan-European civilization. There's just really nothing there. No mentions of mass immigration, no suggestion of a conspiracy or how to mislead or fool people. Just an examination of the existing trends in society at that time, predictions for the future, idealism, many of his outlooks now look horribly dated, and a suggestion that would be really fundamentally obvious to anybody who did set about trying to prevent future European wars and try to forge this new European identity. And that's really all there is there. And honestly, I can see a lot in it to recommend to right-wing nationalists, weirdly, as much as it should appeal to socialist internationalists. I think it's called Practical Idealism, the first book, and there is a ruthless pragmatism to this when you consider the ideas that he was trying to tackle, the problems he was trying to tackle. And unity does lead to less conflict. But there's no plan, there's no conspiracy, there's no need for a conspiracy. It doesn't mention the kind of things that these people like to attach to it at all. There's not really anything else to say. Criticism has not been of the highest quality, shall we say, on the previous video. A lot of commentary has been directed towards my appearance. I am an alternative type guy, a bit of a metalhead and a goth and all the rest of it. Yeah, that's why I dress as I do. Apparently that's somehow degenerate or something. Also, a lot of speculation has been entered into about my race. Now, I realise I have a somewhat prominent brow ridge and a big nose, but to the best of my knowledge, I am not Jewish. I believe there was some wing of the family that was Jewish by marriage in London, but I can't remember for certain. Apocryphally, there's supposed to be a dash of Romany in my ancestry, but you know, we're all mongrels, we're all mutts. There's a bit of everything in everybody. Brits in particular, you've got Angles, Saxon, Picts, Celts, Normans, Danes. Yeah, there's a lot of mixing in Brits, and you go back to the Romans, a bunch of them stayed here, a lot of troops stayed here and had families that would have been brought here from God knows where throughout the Roman Empire. Brits are mutts anyway, but yeah, I'm not mixed race any more than anybody else as far as I know, and I fail to see the relevance. Nor am I Jewish. Again, I fail to see the relevance, nor am I culturally Jewish. I'm an atheist. My family was irreligious, humanist, or just kind of vaguely spiritual, apart from my grandparents on one side. Yeah, none of this criticism has any substance to it. None of it addresses the actual content of anything that I've said. So I don't know why you're so obsessed with Jews in the first place, to be quite honest. And I get a lot of comments, spam comments from people trying to sell right-wing conspiracy books, or spamming for right-wing conspiracy videos about this, that and the other. There's just no substance to any of it. People even unironically mention the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Right, let's have a quick scroll down through the rest of this nonsense and see if there's anything. Did I get paid to make the video? No. Nor this one. And it's 50-50 whether it will be monetized or anything at all. White genocide you keep bringing up, it's not a thing. Show me a death camp. Apparently a lot of racists do know German very well, perhaps, but it's not evident online in any translations of this book or anything, so it would seem not. Lots of anti-immigration sentiment. It depends how it's done, but that's a whole other video. By the way, I get accused of being racist quite often, and put into the white supremacist camp, which is ludicrous if you know anything about me, but it happens. People saying it's not about race, it's about the destruction of culture. Kalergi talks about the preservation of European cultures and national identities just within this superstructure, so that's not right. Am I pro-Zionism? Nationalism makes no sense to me. The idea of a God-ordained homeland makes no sense to me, but we're in the situation we're in, and as such Israel deserves to exist. Apparently I wear a tiny hat. Actually, I have a giant head. That's the problem. It's difficult to find hats that fit. Accusations of being an alky panhandler. Address the things I'm saying. Alright? I think it's fairly obvious that I'm quite articulate and intelligent and make the effort here. I don't like tooting my own horn, but come on. Oh, it's just they've provided me an endless supply of conspiracy theories, like the UN Migration Pact or Agenda 21, which I tackled the other day. Again, lots of just claims that this conspiracy is somehow self-evident. The conspirators admit it. The documentation exists, and it's definitely happening. I can see it happening. Where? Where is the plan? Where are the conspirators? Where is the text in Practical Idealism or Paneuropa that advocates the kind of things that you're talking about? There's just nothing there. Now, the valid criticism was that I was a bit too dismissive, that I hadn't properly read the document and the text, but then neither of any of these other people. Now I've addressed that and I've gone into further depth. Hopefully I've addressed all of that. Now, it's hard work to understand where a lot of these people are coming from, but I think I can understand where they're coming from. I just think it's fucking insane. Hopefully that last swear word hasn't led to me being demonetized. On to fun things. Zang. Old Fat Punks is part caper, part comedy, part nostalgia, and part commentary. It follows three aging punks as they build themselves up for one big, nihilistic last hurrah. You can buy Old Fat Punks at Amazon, Drive-Thru Fiction, or Lulu.com. Follow the links below or search on those sites.